The mud on Stella Ellsworth's boots had gone from brown to black somewhere around the 28th mile, and the rain had not stopped once. Her horse, a Grullo mare named Compass, was trembling beneath her, sides heaving with the effort of carrying them both through the swollen creek crossings and the slick red clay hills of the Texas panhandle. Stella's hair was plastered to her face. Her coat, a heavy canvas duster that had served her father faithfully for 11 years, was soaked clean through to the flannel shirt underneath. She had ridden 40 miles through the worst storm she could remember seeing in her 24 years on this earth, and now she was standing in the doorway of Cecil Sheridan's bunkhouse, while he looked at her like she had lost every last piece of her good sense. "You need to go," Cecil said. His voice was low and rough, the kind of voice that sounded like it had been worn smooth by years of hard weather and harder silences. He stood with his arms crossed, filling the doorframe with his shoulders, lamplight throwing half his face into shadow. "Right now, Stella, before someone sees your horse tied up out front." "I'm not leaving," she said, and her voice did not shake, which she considered a small miracle given that her teeth wanted very badly to chatter. "You are riding into a trap tomorrow morning, Cecil. Harlan Voss has already spoken to Judge Creddy. The deed transfer is forged. If you show up to that land office at 8 o'clock, there will be 3 of Voss's men waiting for you in the alley behind the telegraph building, and the sheriff already has orders to look the other way." The silence that followed was the kind that filled a room the way water fills a boot slowly, completely, until there was no air left in it. Cecil stared at her. Something shifted behind his dark eyes, something she had never seen there before, not the irritation she expected, not the dismissal she had braced herself against, but something raw and off balance, like a man who had reached for solid ground and found it wasn't there. "How do you know that?" he asked. "Because I was in the room when Voss told them," she said. "I was mapping the survey lines in the back of the land office when Voss came in through the private door. He did not know I was there. I heard every word." Another beat of silence. "Stella," he said her name the way a man says something he has been trying not to think about. "You rode 40 miles in this weather to tell me that." "I did." He uncrossed his arms. The lamplight caught the line of his jaw, the tight set of his mouth, the way his throat moved when he swallowed. For a moment he looked less like the most formidable rancher in Caldwell County and more like a man who had just been handed something he did not know how to hold. "Then you are not riding back tonight," he said. "Not through that, not alone." "Cecil, that is not a negotiation, Stella." And there it was. The thing she had not let herself think about during 40 miles of rain and mud and dark, that he would refuse to let her go. That his refusal would feel less like an insult to her independence and more like something dangerously close to the truth of what existed between them, unnamed and unspoken and growing louder every single day. She had known Cecil Sheridan for 3 years. She needed to go back 4 months before that, to the autumn of 1883, to understand how they had arrived at this doorway in the rain. Stella had come to Hartwell, Texas from Abilene, following the work. She was a land surveyor, genuinely, formally, trained by her father Elias Ellsworth, who had learned the craft from a military cartographer during the war, and had passed every ounce of his knowledge to his only child before his heart gave out in the spring of 1879. Elias had believed that a woman who could read the land could never be made helpless, and he had been right. Stella carried a theodolite and a chain measure, and a set of field books that were filled with her own meticulous notations, and she could calculate a property boundary faster and more accurately than any man in 3 counties. She had the contracts to prove it. The work was not easy to come by. Most men who needed surveying done squinted at her and asked when her husband would be arriving, and she had learned to produce her father's original licensing papers along with her own records before anyone thought to ask twice. In Hartwell, she had rented a room above the dry goods store from a widow named Mrs. Partridge, who made excellent coffee and asked no questions about the hours Stella kept. Cecil Sheridan had been her 3rd client. He had come to her through the recommendation of Emmett Frazier, the town's only honest lawyer, who had told him flatly that if he wanted accurate survey work done, he should go see the Ellsworth woman and stop wasting his time with the pair of men currently working for the land office, both of whom were, in Emmett's words, either incompetent or quietly employed by Harlan Voss. Cecil had walked into Mrs. Partridge's back parlor, where Stella kept her equipment and received clients, and he had looked at her for one long moment without speaking. She had looked back. She was used to that moment, the hesitation, the assessment, and she had learned not to fill it with nervous explanation. She simply waited. "Emmett Frazier sent me," he said. "I know who you are, Mr. Sheridan," she said. "You own the Double S Ranch. 6 sections of mixed grass and cedar break east of the Cimarron Fork. You're trying to acquire the Daltrey parcel to the north, which would give you water rights to the creek that runs through the lower canyon. What you need from me is a boundary survey on the Daltrey land that can stand up in a court of law, because someone has been feeding the land office incorrect measurements, and you suspect the numbers are going to come up short in your favor when the deed transfer goes through." Cecil Sheridan had stared at her. Not with condescension, not with the performative skepticism she usually received. He had stared at her with what she recognized, with some surprise, as genuine attention. "That is exactly right," he said. "Sit down," she said. "Let me show you what I have already found." She had begun her examination of the Daltrey parcel 2 weeks earlier, on a hunch she had developed from reading the original government plat maps filed in the county records. The official measurements showed the parcel at 412 acres. Her own preliminary work, done in 3 days of field work with her transit and chain, had returned a number that was 73 acres larger, which meant that either the government had made an error in 1871, when the land was first platted, or someone had since altered the recorded measurements to make the parcel appear smaller than it was, reducing its assessed value and therefore its sale price. She spread her field books across the parlor table and walked Cecil through every calculation, every point of reference, every discrepancy she had flagged. He listened without interrupting. He followed her numbers. When she paused, he asked questions that proved he had understood everything she said, which she had not expected. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The creek access," he said. "If the true boundary is where you say it is, the Daltrey land extends another 1/4 mile north along the creek bank." "Yes," she said. "Which means the water rights are not contested the way Voss has been claiming. The creek is inside the Daltrey parcel, not running along the edge of it. If you acquire this land at the correct boundary, Voss cannot touch your water." She watched his jaw tighten. She watched him look at her field books and then back at her. He had dark eyes, she noticed, the color of good river mud, and there was something in them that was working very hard to process what she had just handed him. "How long will it take you to finish the full survey?" he asked. 2 more weeks in the field," she said. 3 if the weather turns." "Name your price," he said. She named it. He agreed without blinking, which told her either that he was wealthy enough not to care, or that he understood exactly how much he was asking her to do. She suspected both. That had been the beginning. 2 weeks stretched to 3 as a cold front moved in from the northwest and turned the creeks unpredictable. Stella worked through most of it, bundled in her father's canvas duster and wearing the waterproof leather hat that had been her own purchase, a practical and expensive extravagance that she had never once regretted. Cecil rode out to check her progress twice a week, which was more than any other client had ever done, and she had braced herself the first time for the kind of hovering interference she usually received from men who hired her, and then could not quite believe she knew what she was doing. But Cecil did not hover. He arrived, he looked at her field notes, he asked specific and intelligent questions, and then he rode back to his ranch. The second time he came out, he brought a tin of beef stew, still hot, wrapped in burlap, which he handed to her without comment, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world to bring a woman working in a cold field her lunch. She had not known how to respond to that, so she had simply thanked him and eaten it, and it had been the best thing she tasted in a week. By the end of the third week, she had completed the survey. Her results confirmed her preliminary findings and added 3 additional boundary markers that had been physically moved stakes driven into different positions than their original placements, a discovery that was not incompetence but deliberate fraud. She wrote it up in a formal report, attached her calculations, and delivered it to Cecil at the Double S Ranch. He read every page at his kitchen table while she sat across from him drinking the coffee he had poured without asking, which was also exactly how she took it. When he finished, he set the report down and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on a man's face before, not directed at her work. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something closer to recognition, the look of a person who has just understood something important about another person that they will not be able to unknow. "You found where they moved the stakes," he said. "I found 3 of them. Possibly a 4th, but the original plat reference for that corner is ambiguous enough that I cannot prove it without the original survey notes from 1871, and those may not exist anymore. Voss's man was out here in the fall asking questions about the northern boundary," Cecil said, "2 months before I ever approached Daltrey about buying the land." Stella looked at him steadily. "Then Voss knew you wanted it before you made an offer." "Or he made sure I would want it," Cecil said quietly, "and then made sure the terms would suit him when I went to buy." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the cedar brakes with a sound like something breathing. "Mr. Sheridan," Stella said, "I think you should take this report to Emmett Frazier and let him advise you before you file anything at the land office. The alterations I found are the kind that someone will want buried before they become part of the official record." He looked at her for a long moment. "You think there is someone in the land office on Voss's payroll?" "I think it would be very foolish to assume otherwise," she said. Something in his expression shifted, became warmer and more complicated. "You're right," he said, "and that is not the first time I have thought that about you, Miss Ellsworth." She had felt heat rise in her face and had done her considerable best to ignore it. She had taken her payment, shaken his hand across the kitchen table. His hand was large and warm and calloused in the exact places that told you a man worked his own land alongside his men and ridden back to Hartwell. She had not expected to be hired again so quickly. But Emmett Frazier, after reviewing her survey and Cecil's documentation, had reached out to her within a week. The case against the fraudulent boundary alterations would need to be presented with expert testimony, and Emmett wanted Stella to serve as the expert. She agreed. She also agreed, quietly and separately, when Emmett asked her to take a look at 2 other parcels in the county that had irregularities in their recorded measurements, because Emmett had his own suspicions about the land office that went far beyond Harlan Voss and Cecil's property dispute. That was how she had come to spend so much time at the Hartwell land office over the following months. She had legitimate reasons to be there reviewing recorded plats, checking survey notes, comparing measurements. And it was there, in the back room on a gray November afternoon, that she had been working at the drafting table when Harlan Voss had walked in through the private entrance that connected the land office to the building next door, which he owned. Harlan Voss was 51 years old, heavy through the chest and neck, with the kind of wealth that had become indistinguishable from certainty. He treated every room he entered like it was already his. He came in with 2 men Stella recognized as his foreman, Red Cutler, and a man she only knew as Briggs, and he had spoken for nearly 15 minutes without once lowering his voice, because he believed he was alone. Stella had not moved. She had barely breathed. She had sat behind the tall cabinet partition, her pencil suspended above her field book, and she had listened to Harlan Voss lay out, in precise and confident detail, the plan to destroy Cecil Sheridan. The deed for the Daltrey parcel had already been altered, Voss said. The forged version showed the boundaries as originally misrecorded, not as Stella's survey had found them. The judge had been spoken to, not threatened, exactly, but given to understand certain things about the convenience of ruling in the correct direction. And when Sheridan arrived at the land office for the 8 o'clock appointment that Voss's man had arranged, posing as a Daltrey representative, there would be 3 armed men waiting in the alley behind the telegraph building. The sheriff, a man named Cully Pratt who owed Voss more than one significant favor, would be otherwise occupied. Stella had waited until she heard the private door close. Then she had gathered her field books with careful, deliberate hands, walked down the back stairs, gone to the livery stable where she kept Compass, and ridden north toward the Double S Ranch without stopping to change her clothes or eat her supper or wait for the storm that had been building in the western sky to pass. 40 miles. She had been riding for 3 hours before the rain started, and then the rain had not stopped. And now she was here. "There is a spare room at the end of the hall," Cecil said. He had moved back from the doorway to let her in, and Stella stepped inside and stood on the plank floor of the bunkhouse entry while the mud from her boots began quietly ruining the wood. "My housekeeper, Ruth, keeps it made up for when Emmett stays over." "I am not staying the night," Stella said automatically. Cecil looked at her. Outside, lightning split the sky, and a heartbeat later, thunder rolled through the ground beneath their feet. "Stella," he said, "it is past midnight. The creek at Miller's Crossing has been flooding since 4 o'clock this afternoon. If you ride south now, you will hit that crossing in the dark, in the rain, alone, and if Compass puts a foot wrong in that current. I know what a flooded creek crossing is, Cecil. Then you know I cannot let you ride into one at midnight." She wanted to argue. She had arguments ready. She had been crossing flooded creeks since she was 14 years old. She had crossed worse terrain than this in worse conditions. She was not a woman who required someone else to decide what risks were acceptable to her. All of those things were true, and she knew they were true, and Cecil, she suspected, knew them too. But she also knew the Miller's Crossing ford. She had surveyed it 2 months ago. The creek bed dropped sharply on the south bank, a feature that was manageable in dry conditions and genuinely dangerous in high water, especially after dark when you could not read the surface for depth. "The room," she said finally. "I will take the room. I will need feed for Compass." "I'll have one of my men see to her," Cecil said. "I'll do it myself," Stella said. "Where is your barn?" He looked at her for another moment. Then something in his face relaxed, just slightly, the way a tightly held rope goes slack when the weight on the other end shifts. "I'll show you," he said. The barn was warm and dry and smelled of hay and horse, and the particular comfortable darkness of a well-kept stable. Cecil held the lantern while Stella unsaddled Compass and checked each of the mare's legs with careful, practiced hands, running her fingers down the tendons and feeling for heat or swelling. Compass had given everything she had tonight. The least Stella could do was make sure she was all right before she let anyone else see to her. Cecil watched without speaking. He held the lantern steady and he watched, and when Stella found the small cut on Compass's left foreleg where she had caught it on some unseen debris in the dark, Cecil moved without being asked, going to the tack room and returning with a tin of pine tar salve that he handed to Stella, again without comment, the way he had handed her that tin of beef stew in the cold field 3 months ago. She cleaned the cut and applied the salve. She settled Compass into a clean stall with fresh hay and a bucket of oats, then checked the water trough. When she was satisfied, she stepped back from the stall and looked at Cecil, who was still watching her with that expression she had first seen at his kitchen table recognition, warm and unguarded and slightly off balance. "She's a good horse," he said. "She is the best horse I have ever known," Stella said, and her voice came out softer than she intended, because she was thinking about 40 miles of rain and mud and dark and how Compass had never once faltered, had never once tried to quit. "You named her Compass," Cecil said. "My father chose the name. Your father trained you to survey." "Yes, he must have been a remarkable man." Stella looked at him. The lantern light was gold and steady between them, and the rain hammered on the barn roof with a sound like something trying to get in. "He was the best man I ever knew," she said simply, "and the most practical. He said a woman who can read the land is never lost." Cecil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father used to say that a man who can read the sky and the water will never starve." Did you believe him? I believe it now, Cecil said. I didn't when I was young. When I was young, I thought you won things by being harder and louder than everything around you. He paused. I was wrong about a lot of things when I was young. They walked back to the main house through the rain, running the last 20 yards because the weather had turned vicious again, and they came through the back door into the kitchen laughing, both of them soaked through the last inch of their respective clothes. And the laughter was unexpected and warm, and it sat between them in the kitchen like a coal someone had forgotten to remove from the fire. Ruth, the housekeeper, was a small and sensible woman in her 50s who appeared in the kitchen doorway in her robe and took one look at Stella and went silently to heat water for a bath without anyone asking. Stella was too tired and too cold to object to this plan. She accepted the bath, accepted the dry clothes Ruth produced. They were Ruth's own, a heavy wool dress that was slightly too short for Stella's long legs and fitted somewhat loosely across the shoulders, but warm. And she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee strong enough to hold a spoon upright while Cecil sat across from her, and they talked through everything she had heard in the land office. She told it straight and in order, the way she recorded measurements, every detail in its proper place, nothing added, nothing omitted. Cecil listened the way he always listened to her, which was with his whole attention, not dividing it between what she was saying and what he thought about her saying it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. His hands were flat on the table, and she looked at them square, steady, scarred across the knuckles from some old encounter with wire or wood, she didn't know which. "The deed is already forged," he said. "That means they've already been inside the records." "Yes. And if you show up at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, even without the men in the alley, you will be signing your name to a document that legalizes the theft of your water rights. Even if you survived what comes after, the paperwork would be used against you." "How do I fight a forged deed?" "You fight it with my survey," Stella said, "and you fight it by not being in that alley when Voss's men arrive." She pulled her field book from her coat, which was hanging on the chair, back to dry. Even after 40 miles in the rain, the oilcloth cover had kept the pages dry. She opened it to the relevant pages and set it on the table between them. "These measurements are real, Cecil. They are precise, they are documented, and they are signed by me. More importantly, I have the original government plat notes from 1871. I found them last week in a box in the county records room that had been mislabeled. They support my survey numbers exactly." Cecil looked at the field book. He looked at her. "You found the 1871 plat notes," he said slowly. "The ones that would confirm the original boundaries." "I did. I made copies." She reached into the inside breast pocket of the canvas duster and produced 2 folded sheets of paper. "I always make copies." He reached across the table and took the papers carefully. He unfolded them. He read them with his full attention. And then he looked up at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, not just recognition, not just respect, but something that was very close to wonder. "Stella," he said. "They're enough," she said. "With these and my completed survey and Emmett's legal argument, Voss's forged deed falls apart. The alterations to the boundary markers, combined with the discrepancy between the forged deed and the 1871 plat notes, constitute evidence of fraud. Emmett can take this to a territorial judge, someone outside Voss's reach." Cecil set the papers down. He looked at them for another moment. Then he looked at her, and his dark eyes were doing something complicated and unguarded, and she felt her own chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the cold or the 40 miles or the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. "You planned all of this," he said, "before tonight. You had already found the plat notes. You were already building a case." "I suspected something like this was coming," she said carefully. "The pattern of the alterations I found in the original survey was not random. It was systematic. Someone with knowledge of land records and the patience to manipulate them over time. That is not a crime of opportunity." And when I realized how much the fraudulent boundaries would benefit Voss specifically, it became clear that the target was not just the Daltrey parcel. The target was me, Cecil said. The target was your water. Without the creek access, the Double S cannot sustain its current herd through a dry year. Voss knows your finances. He has been buying up debt notes from smaller ranchers in this county for 3 years. If he controls your water and forces a bad season, he can wait you out. Cecil was very still. You have been thinking about this longer than tonight. I have been thinking about it since I found the moved boundary stakes, she admitted. 3 months ago. Another silence. The rain on the roof was beginning to soften, the worst of the storm moving east. Ruth had gone back to bed. The kitchen was warm and quiet and lit by 2 lamps, and the table between them was covered in Stella's precise handwriting and her father's careful measurements, and Cecil Sheridan was looking at her like she was something he was only now beginning to fully see. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked. The question was genuine, not accusatory. "Because I needed proof, not suspicion," she said. "I did not want to bring you half a case and send you in the wrong direction." She paused. "And I needed those plat notes." He nodded slowly. Then quietly he said, "And tonight, when you heard Voss in the land office." "I rode," she said simply. 40 miles, he said. In that, she looked at him steadily. It seemed important. Something crossed his face, something that moved quickly and deeply like a current under still water. He looked down at the table. His hands moved just slightly toward hers and then stopped. "Yes," he said very quietly. "It was." The morning came gray and cool, the storm having washed the sky clean overnight. Stella woke in the spare room that smelled of cedar and old lavender, with the light coming thin and silver through the curtains, and for a single disoriented moment she forgot where she was. Then she heard Cecil's voice in the hall, low and steady, and she remembered everything. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, which Ruth had dried by the kitchen fire overnight. Her boots were still damp but had not shrunk. She braided her dark hair with practiced speed, standing at the small mirror above the washstand, and went out to find the kitchen already alive with the smell of coffee and biscuits and something frying in the cast iron pan. Ruth looked at her with the pleasant neutrality of a woman who had seen a great many things in her years and formed opinions about none of them out loud. She handed Stella a coffee cup. Stella sat down. Cecil came in from outside, still in his work coat with mud on his boots and the morning air clinging to his hair. He looked at her and something in his face settled like a thing that had been uncertain and was now certain. "I've already sent a rider to Emmett," he said, sitting down across from her. "He'll be here by 7. The appointment at the land office is at 8. We are not going to that appointment." "Good," Stella said. "But Voss will know something went wrong when I don't show. His men will report back." "Then you need Emmett to move quickly," Stella said. "The territorial court in Amarillo has a circuit judge, a man named Holbrook, who is not in Voss's pocket. Emmett needs to get a preliminary injunction filed before Voss has a chance to destroy the altered records or move the forged deed." Cecil looked at her. "How do you know Judge Holbrook isn't in Voss's pocket?" "Because I did a survey job for him last year," Stella said. "He is the kind of man who will be genuinely furious when he understands what has been done with the land records in this county. Judges who care about property law take boundary fraud personally." Cecil almost smiled. It was a small, slow thing, that almost smile, the kind that had clearly not been practiced very much. "You know everyone useful," he said. "I know everyone who has ever needed a survey done," she said. "That turns out to be most of the people who matter." Emmett Frazier arrived at 7:10, which meant he had ridden hard from his house in town before the sun was fully up. He was a compact man in his 40s with sharp, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and when he walked into the kitchen and saw both Cecil and Stella at the table with the field books and the copied plat notes spread between them, he stopped in the doorway and said, "I see you found the problem before the problem found you." "Stella found it," Cecil said. Emmett looked at Stella with deep appreciation. "Of course she did." They spent the next 2 hours at that kitchen table, the 3 of them building the case piece by piece. Emmett read the plat notes, read Stella's survey, cross-referenced the measurements, and then put his hands flat on the table in the same gesture she had seen from Cecil the night before and said, "This is enough for Holbrook. This is more than enough." "Can you get to Amarillo today?" Cecil asked. "I can leave within the hour," Emmett said. "But Cecil, you need to understand, once I file this injunction, Voss will know exactly what happened and exactly who was responsible. He is not a man who accepts that kind of thing quietly." "I know what kind of man he is," Cecil said. "He'll go after the evidence first," Stella said. They both looked at her. "The original plat notes are still in the county records room. Voss has access to that building through the private entrance. If he realizes the plat notes are what's being used against him, he will go after them. Then we need to remove them from the records room before I file," Emmett said. "That is technically tampering with public records," Stella said. "That is protecting evidence from destruction," Emmett said firmly. "There is a difference, and Judge Holbrook will understand it." Stella looked at him. Then she reached into her coat and produced the original plat notes, the actual originals, not the copies she had given Cecil the night before. Both men stared. "You already took them," Cecil said. "I removed them from an unsecured, mislabeled box in a records room that is regularly accessed by a man engaged in systematic land fraud," Stella said. "I have maintained them in their original condition. The copies I gave you last night are exact reproductions. The originals are here." She set them on the table. "I did it 2 days ago before I had any idea what I was going to overhear yesterday." Emmett laughed. It was a short, startled, delighted sound. "Stella Ellsworth," he said, "you are the most competent person in this county." She glanced at Cecil. He was not laughing. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one that had started 3 months ago over a kitchen table covered in survey notes, and that had been growing in him ever since, growing the way a river grows after a long rain, quietly, persistently, until you looked up and realized the whole landscape had changed. Emmett left for Amarillo within the hour, carrying the original 1871 plat notes, Stella's complete survey, and a letter from Cecil documenting the pattern of Voss's actions over the preceding 18 months. He also carried a secondary letter from Stella, signed in her professional capacity as a licensed land surveyor, attesting to the technical facts of the boundary alterations and the forged deed discrepancy. It was the most important document she had ever signed her name to. She had done it without hesitating. After Emmett rode out, Cecil came and stood beside Stella in the yard, and they both looked at the morning clean and wide and washed to brightness by the previous night's storm, the grass still dark with water, the sky already going a deep and serious blue. "Compass should rest another day," Cecil said. "Her leg," Stella thought about arguing. She thought about the fact that she had clients in Hartwell, obligations, a room above Mrs. Partridge's store, a life that was her own and had been entirely her own for 5 years. She thought about 40 miles of rain and mud and the feeling of his almost smile. "One day," she said. That day was the beginning of something that neither of them had the exact words for yet, but that both of them felt with the clarity of survey lines on good paper. They spent the morning checking the cattle in the north pasture. Cecil had intended to do it alone, but somehow she was beside him, and she could ride well enough that he did not have to slow down for her, which she knew mattered to him. She did not know how she knew that. She just did. In the afternoon, she sat at his kitchen table with a fresh field book and began working through the additional measurement discrepancies she had been tracking in the county records, the ones Emmett had asked her to investigate. Cecil sat across from her with his account ledgers and his own papers, and the two of them worked in the same room in a silence that was not uncomfortable but full, the way silence gets between people who are both concentrating on something real. Twice, he got up to refill her coffee without asking. Both times she did not look up, but she felt it, the attention of it, the care in the ordinary gesture. That evening, Ruth cooked a proper supper, and they ate it at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and the window going gold with the last of the daylight. And Cecil talked about the ranch, about his intentions for the northern pasture if the water rights were secured, about the grass management system he had been reading about in an agricultural circular from Kansas City. He talked about it the way people talk about things when they want to be known, not performing, not impressing, but opening something and offering it to the other person to look at. She talked about her work, about the most difficult survey she had ever done, a mountain parcel in New Mexico Territory in 1881, where 3 separate parties had 3 separate claims, and every single set of existing measurements was wrong in a different direction. She talked about the moment she had realized the error lying on her back in the snow at 2 in the morning looking at the stars and doing spherical geometry in her head, triangulating from known star positions to reconstruct the original survey baseline. She had solved it in 40 minutes and gone back to sleep in her bedroll, and in the morning she had confirmed it with the theodolite, and it was exactly right. Cecil listened to this story the way he listened to everything she said. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You did spherical geometry," he said, "in the snow, at 2 in the morning, in your head." "It is not as impressive as it sounds," she said. "My father drilled it into me from childhood. It becomes instinct eventually." "It is exactly as impressive as it sounds," he said, with a directness that made her look up from her coffee cup and meet his eyes, and what she found there made her chest do that thing again, the tightening that had nothing to do with cold or exhaustion. She looked away first. She did not usually look away first. 3 days passed before Emmett returned from Amarillo, and in those 3 days Stella stayed at the Double S because Compass needed rest, and because the county road through the lower valley was still flooded in places, and because there was always a reason, it turned out, when you wanted there to be one. Cecil did not push her or press her. He did not treat her like a guest who needed entertaining or a woman who needed managing. He simply went about his days and included her in them, naturally and without fanfare, and she found that she was not fighting it the way she had expected to fight it. She was good at fighting things. She was very good at maintaining the boundaries she needed to maintain to do her work and live the life she had built. She had learned that the world would take as much as you let it, and she had developed considerable discipline about what she let it take. But Cecil Sheridan did not take. He offered, and that was different in a way she had not been prepared for. On the second evening, they sat on the porch after supper and watched the stars come out over the Texas plain, and Stella found herself thinking about her father, about the night he had shown her how to find the North Star, and then told her that the difference between being lost and being found was often just a matter of knowing what you were looking for. She told Cecil this. He listened, and then he was quiet for a while, and then he said that his own father had been a hard man, not cruel but hard, the kind of man who could not show what he felt and so spent his whole life being strong in ways that were not quite the right ways. "He built this ranch," Cecil said, "with his own hands from nothing. I watched him work until he couldn't work anymore, and then he died, and this was his. He left it to me, and I have been trying to figure out ever since what I owe him and what I owe myself." Stella looked at the stars for a moment. "You don't owe him anything," she said. "What you build from what he left you is yours. The debt died with him." Cecil looked at her sharply, then not sharply at all. "My pastor would argue with that." "Your pastor can take it up with the stars," she said, and Cecil laughed. A full and genuine laugh that she had not heard from him before, a laugh that opened him up completely, and she felt something break loose in her chest like ice cracking on a spring river. On the third morning, Emmett came back. He rode into the yard at mid-morning with dust on his coat and a set to his face that she had learned to read as carefully controlled triumph. Cecil came out of the barn and Stella came from the garden, where she had been talking to Ruth about the squash beds, and Emmett looked at both of them and said, "Judge Holbrook has issued a temporary injunction against the Daltrey deed transfer. He is also ordering a criminal investigation into the alteration of the county land records and has sent 2 federal marshals to take charge of the records room." Cecil let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for some time. "And Voss?" Stella asked. "Voss has been informed that his presence is required in Amarillo for questioning," Emmett said. "He tried to claim the whole thing was a misunderstanding and that the survey data was incorrect." Holbrook's response was, and I am quoting, that he finds the word of a licensed surveyor considerably more credible than the word of a man whose employee was caught moving boundary stakes. Stella's eyebrows rose. "They found the man who moved the stakes. One of the federal marshals has an interesting talent for getting men to talk quickly," Emmett said. "Voss's foreman, Cutler, apparently decided that loyalty had its limits when the conversation turned toward federal conspiracy charges." He paused. "It is over, Cecil. The injunction holds the deed. The criminal investigation will likely result in charges. And your water rights are secured pending the formal court ruling, which Holbrook expects to issue within 30 days based on the plat evidence." The three of them stood in the yard for a moment. Emmett looked from Cecil to Stella and back again with the expression of a man who has seen something obvious to everyone except the two people most closely involved. "I will be riding back to town," Emmett said. "There is a great deal of paperwork to be done." He paused. "Stella, I imagine you will be returning to your room at Mrs. Partridge's." Stella opened her mouth. Cecil said, "In a while." Emmett smiled, mounted his horse, and rode back down the ranch road without another word. Stella stood in the yard beside Cecil and looked at the distance where Emmett had gone. The morning was bright and warm, the first truly warm day since the storm. The grass was green and smelled of water and earth and the particular living scent of the Texas plain after rain. "In a while," she repeated. "If you want to go," Cecil said, "I will ride with you as far as town." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the same distance she had been looking at, his profile steady against the sky, and she could see the set of his jaw and the way he was holding himself very carefully, the way a man holds himself when he wants very much to say something and is not certain what receiving it will cost him. "Cecil," she said. He turned to look at her. "What are you trying to say?" She asked directly because she had always preferred directness, had built her entire professional life on the value of precision. He was quiet for one long moment. Then he said, "I would like it if you stayed, not because your horse needs rest or because the roads are flooded, because he stopped, started again, because I have not spent 3 days with another person in as long as I can remember and not wished for it to end." She looked at him. His dark eyes were open in a way that cost him something. She could see it costing him, the same way hard truth always costs, regardless of whether the ground under you is firm. "I am not a woman who settles," she said. It was important that he understood this precisely. "I will not give up my work. I will not give up my independence. I will not be managed or decided for." "I know that," he said immediately. And she believed him because it was not the response of a man saying what he thought she needed to hear. It was the response of a man who had been paying attention. "I am also not a woman who is afraid of wanting things," she said, and her own voice surprised her with its steadiness. "I have wanted things my whole life and gone after them without apology. I want to keep doing that." "I would not want you to be any other way," he said. "Stella." He said her name the way he had said it the night she arrived at his door, like it was something he had been holding in his hands for a while. "I fell in love with you in that parlor at Mrs. Partridge's, the day you told me everything I already suspected about my own land before I had said a single word about it. I have been trying to be sensible about it ever since." She was quiet for a moment. The breeze moved between them. A meadowlark called somewhere in the grass beyond the fence line. "How is that working for you?" she asked. And there was the smile, not the almost smile this time, but the real thing, full and unguarded and transforming his whole face. "Badly," he said. She stepped toward him and he met her, and when he took her hand carefully like something worth the care, she felt the warmth of it move all the way up her arm to somewhere central and permanent. "I am not making any decisions about anything today," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "Absolutely clear," he agreed, "but I will stay for lunch." "Lunch," he said. and possibly supper. We will see about supper. It was supper, and the next morning's breakfast, and the morning after that's ride through the North Pasture, and somewhere in the slow, certain weeks that followed, Stella Ellsworth stopped thinking of her room above Mrs. Partridge's store as her home and started thinking of it as her office, which was a distinction that surprised her less than she expected. She did not move to the double S all at once. She had too much dignity for that, and she had surveying contracts to fulfill that kept her in the field for days at a time, and there were the ongoing proceedings against Voss that required her presence in Amarillo twice in as many months. But when she was not in the field or in a courtroom or working from her drafting table in the back room she now kept at the double S, she was at Cecil's kitchen table, or on Cecil's porch, or riding the fence lines of Cecil's land, which she was beginning to think of as simply the land, shared between them, extending in all directions with the certain precision of a well-made survey. The proceedings against Harlan Voss concluded in the spring of 1884, 6 months after the night Stella rode 40 miles in the rain. Voss was found guilty of land record fraud, conspiracy, and several ancillary charges relating to his manipulation of local officials. He was fined extensively, his forged deed was nullified, and Red Cutler received a sentence that put him well out of anyone's business for the foreseeable future. The corrupt surveyors who had altered the original boundary stakes were similarly dealt with, and the county records were audited, a process that Stella was hired to assist with at Emmett's recommendation, and that occupied her for the better part of 3 months and resulted in the correction of 11 additional fraudulent boundary records across the county. It was good work. It was the most significant work she had ever done, and she was not modest about it to herself, though she was characteristically direct about it in her formal report, which described what had been done and how it had been corrected without theatrical flourish. Judge Holbrook sent her a personal letter afterward, which she kept. On a warm evening in late April, after the last of the Voss proceedings had been concluded, and the land office had been placed under new management, and the Daltrey deed had been transferred to Cecil's name with the correct boundaries, Cecil asked Stella to walk with him to the northern fence line of the newly acquired parcel. She walked with him through the new green grass to the place where the creek ran clear and quick in its correct channel, the water that was now legally and permanently part of the double S. He stopped there on the bank of the creek with the sun going low and orange in the west, and he turned to look at her. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you are owed." She raised an eyebrow. "I have been paid for my survey work." "Not by me," he said quietly. "Not for any of the rest of it. For the 40 miles in the rain, for the plat notes, for 3 months of quietly building a case that saved everything I have built." He paused. "I owe you more than I can put a price on, Stella." "You owe me nothing," she said, in the same tone she had used to tell him his father's debt had died with his father. "I did not ride that night because of what you owe me. I rode it because she stopped, looked at the water, began again. Because it mattered, you mattered. I had not admitted that to myself yet, but it was the truth, and the truth has a way of moving your legs whether or not your head has caught up with it." He looked at her for a long time. The water ran beside them. A red-tailed hawk turned slow circles above the far field. "Then let me ask you something I should have asked sooner," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced something small and wrapped in a piece of cloth, and when he opened it she saw the ring, not elaborate. A woman surveyor had no use for elaborate but beautiful in its own way. A thin gold band set with a small dark garnet, simple and permanent and warm in the evening light. "Marry me," he said, "on whatever terms you need. Keep your work, keep your name if you like, keep your drafting table and your theodolite and your field boots and your mare and everything that is yours. Just let what is mine be yours too, and let what is yours be mine, and let us figure out the rest of it together." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about her father telling her that the difference between lost and found was knowing what you were looking for. She thought about 40 miles of rain. She thought about a tin of beef stew handed over without comment in a cold field, and a lantern held steady in a dark barn, and two flat hands on a kitchen table looking at the same evidence and reaching the same conclusion, and a laugh that had broken something loose in her chest like spring ice. She thought about the kind of person who holds a light steady for someone else doing their work. She thought that this was, in her experience, the rarest kind of person there was. Yes, she said, on those terms. He put the ring on her finger, and it fit, which should not have surprised her but did, just slightly, with a pleasure that was quiet and precise, like the satisfaction of a measurement that comes out exactly right on the first attempt. He kissed her there on the bank of the creek, in the warm April evening, with the water running clear in its correct channel and the hawks still turning overhead, and the grass of their land going gold in the last light, and it was nothing like she had expected. It was not careful or tentative or uncertain. It was the kiss of a man who had known exactly what he wanted for 6 months and was only now, finally, allowed to be direct about it, and it lit something in her that was warm and steady and not at all inclined to be managed. They were married in June, at the small church in Hartwell, with Emmett Frazier standing as Cecil's witness and Mrs. Partridge, thoroughly delighted, standing as Stella's. Ruth cooked the wedding supper. Judge Holbrook sent a gift, a leather-bound set of the territorial survey statutes, a present so precisely suited to the recipient that Stella suspected Emmett had advised him on it. Stella kept her name professionally Stella Ellsworth, licensed land surveyor, and added Sheridan to it in the private spaces, in the letters she wrote, in the way she thought of herself in quiet moments. Stella Ellsworth Sheridan. It was longer than she was used to, but she had never minded long measurements when they were accurate. She kept her drafting table in the room that had become her study at the Double S, and she continued to take contracts throughout the county and into the neighboring territories, because the work was hers and she was good at it, and it mattered to her. Cecil never once suggested otherwise. He was genuinely interested in her projects in the way that he was interested in everything she did, not performatively, not because he thought he should be, but because she was who she was and he found her endlessly, specifically interesting. She was equally interested in the ranch, in the land, in the decisions that shaped what this place was and what it could become. She had surveyed enough land to understand what made a piece of it exceptional, and the Double S was exceptional. The soil quality in the lower pastures, the water system that the creek now anchored, the grass diversity in the cedar breaks that gave the cattle options in hard seasons. She had opinions about all of it and she expressed them, and Cecil listened and argued back when he disagreed and was eventually persuaded or persuaded her in return. And it was the best kind of argument, the kind built on mutual respect and shared investment. They had their first real argument 3 months into the marriage, about a contract Stella had accepted from a developer in Amarillo to survey land that Cecil thought was being purchased for ethically questionable development, land that would displace several existing small homesteaders along the southern river bend. It was a genuine disagreement, and it was sharp for 2 days. Stella had arguments on the side of professional obligation and the fact that she could not control what her survey work was used for. Cecil had arguments on the side of consequences and the homesteaders by name, because he knew them. On the 3rd day, Stella went and looked at the homesteaders' claims herself, and she came back and told the developer she would not take the contract, and she wrote in her journal that evening that Cecil had been right, and that it had been uncomfortable to admit, but not as uncomfortable as the alternative. She did not tell him this directly for 2 more days, but when she did, he did not say he had told her so, which she appreciated enormously. In the autumn of 1884, she discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for 2 weeks before she was certain, and she had continued her field work throughout, because there was nothing about being pregnant that made a theodolite inaccurate or her calculations wrong, and Mrs. Davenport, the doctor's wife who served as the local midwife, had no objection to a pregnant woman doing measured outdoor work in reasonable weather. She told Cecil on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table before Ruth arrived. She simply said it directly, the way she said everything. She was expecting a child in the spring. She expected the pregnancy to proceed normally. She intended to continue working through the winter and into the early spring months, and she wanted him to understand that she was telling him because he had a right to know, and because she wanted him to know, and not because she required anything particular from him that she was not already receiving. He had been very quiet for a moment. Then he had come around the table and put his arms around her, very carefully, and rested his face against her hair, and she had felt him breathe in a long, slow, complicated breath, and she had understood that what moved in him in this moment was something large and private and not easily put into words. She put her hand over his arm and held it there, and they stayed like that for a while in the morning quiet. "Are you all right?" he asked finally into her hair. "I am very well," she said. Slightly tired in the evenings and occasionally annoyed by the smell of frying lard, but otherwise entirely well. He laughed, not the full laugh but the quiet one, the one she had come to know as the laugh reserved for moments that were too full for a bigger sound. "I am going to be a father," he said, and his voice had something in it she had never heard before, something that was wonder and fear and love all spoken at the same time. "You are," she said. "You will be excellent at it." She heard him swallow. "How do you know?" "Because you are excellent at taking care of things you love," she said. "I have observed it in considerable detail over the past year." He tightened his arms around her gently. "Stella," he said, "yes, thank you, for 40 miles in the rain, for all of it." "Cecil," she said very gently, "stop thanking me for that." "I will thank you for it every day of my life," he said. She sighed, in the specific tone she used for losing arguments she had already decided not to fight very hard. "Then I will endeavor to receive it graciously," she said, "starting sometime in the future. Currently I find it excessive." He laughed for real then, and she felt it all the way through her, warm and permanent like the sun on good survey ground. Their son was born in March of 1885, on a mild night that followed a day of light rain. He was healthy and loud, and had his father's dark eyes and Stella's particular expression of concentrated evaluation whenever something was presented to him that he was deciding whether to approve of. They named him Elias, for Stella's father, and Cecil did not hesitate when she proposed it, simply said that it was the right name, and that Elias Ellsworth had raised the most remarkable person Cecil had ever known, and there was no better name for their son. Elias Sheridan grew up knowing the land from both his parents' different and complementary angles. His father's instinctive, hands-on, relationship-based understanding, and his mother's precise, systematic, mathematical reading. By the time he was 4, he could recognize different grass species by sight, which was his father's teaching, and he could tell you how many paces from the fence post to the creek bend, which was his mother's. By the time he was 7, he had begun to develop an interest in his mother's theodolite that she both encouraged and regulated, because the instrument was expensive and the brass was fragile and he was, after all, 7. Emmett Frazier came to dinner at the Double S at least twice a month, and was the child's unofficial uncle in all the ways that mattered. He had been the best man at the wedding. He had held Elias on the day of his birth, and looked at the baby with an expression of complete helplessness, and he had been present at every significant turning point in both Cecil's and Stella's professional lives, which were intertwined now in the way that the lives of people who share land and love and purpose tend to be. Ruth stayed on as housekeeper through all of it, and watched the family grow with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had recognized what was developing before either of the principals had admitted it to themselves, and had the good sense not to say so out loud at the time. In the summer of 1886, when Elias was 15 months old and just finding his feet with the specific determination of a person who has decided that walking is non-negotiable, Stella finished her audit report on the county land records, the formal conclusion of the work she had begun in the wake of the Voss proceedings. It was the most comprehensive and technically demanding document she had produced in her career to date. It was 340 pages of precise measurement records, corrected boundaries, historical plat analysis, and surveying methodology, and it was submitted to the Territorial Land Office in Amarillo with a cover letter from Judge Holbrook recommending it as the basis for a revised county land registry. The report was accepted. The registry was revised. 2 years later, when the territorial legislature began developing standards for land survey methodology across Texas, Stella Ellsworth Sheridan was invited to submit testimony, which she did, in person, in Austin, with Cecil sitting in the gallery watching her speak to the legislative committee with the same quiet attention he had given everything she had ever said, and with an expression on his face that anyone who knew him would recognize immediately as the specific kind of pride that belongs to people who love each other without wanting to diminish each other. She was 31 years old, and she was the most thorough land surveyor in the territory, and she had never once been sorry about any decision that had led her to that moment. They had a second child in 1887, a girl they named Marin, who came into the world with opinions already formed and lungs to express them. She had Stella's dark hair and a disposition toward climbing things that caused her father considerable anxiety, but her mother observed with some amusement that she always got down safely, and that she had excellent spatial judgment for a 2-year-old. Elias adored her from the beginning, following her around with the patient attention of a boy who has decided his sister is his primary responsibility, a dynamic that Stella observed with private delight and allowed to develop undisturbed. The Double S Ranch continued to grow, managed by Cecil with the same steady, unpretentious competence that had built it in the first place. The water rights secured by the correct boundaries made the difference in the dry summer of 1887, when neighboring ranches ran short and the Double S did not. Cecil quietly provided water access to 2 of the smaller neighboring operations during the worst of it, at no charge, because he could and because it was right. Stella watched him do this and felt, as she had felt many times over the years, the specific satisfaction of being married to a man whose values she respected. She expressed this to him one evening when the children were asleep, and the lamp was low and they were sitting together on the porch in the warm dark, her head leaning against his shoulder, his arm around her. "I respect you," she said, which was not a common way for a person to express affection but was entirely characteristic of Stella Ellsworth Sheridan. He turned his head to look at her. "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "You are a good man, and not in the ordinary way people mean that, where they mean a man who is not obviously bad. I mean you are genuinely, specifically, carefully good. You think about what is right and you do it. It is not performative. It is just who you are." He was quiet for a moment. "You are going to make me embarrassingly emotional on my own porch," he said. "You have made me embarrassingly emotional on this porch at least 4 times," she said. "I am simply evening the score." He pulled her closer, very gently, and pressed his lips to her temple, and they sat there in the quiet dark while the cattle settled in the pasture, and the stars came out over the Texas plain, and the night breathed around them, large and old and indifferent to human concerns in the specific way that wide country is, which paradoxically made human concerns feel more important, not less. "Stella," he said, very quietly. "Do you know that the night you showed up in my doorway," he said, "soaking wet and absolutely certain, and you told me everything I needed to know without once asking me to make it easier for you to tell me, I thought, this is the most remarkable person I have ever seen in my life." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him. The lamplight from the window made his face warm and familiar and still, after all this time, capable of making her chest do that thing. "You thought that when I was dripping mud on your bunkhouse floor," she said. "I thought it when you were dripping mud on my bunkhouse floor, yes," he said. "I had been thinking a version of it since the parlor at Mrs. Partridge's, but that night made it completely clear." She looked at him for a long moment. "I thought," she said, "when I was about halfway through the rain, around the 23rd or 24th mile, that if I arrived and you were not worth warning, I was going to be extremely irritated." He laughed, that full laugh that still opened him up completely every single time. "And was I?" "You were worth it," she said. "You have been worth everything." She kissed him then on the porch in the dark, and he kissed her back with the warmth and certainty of a man who has spent years learning exactly one person, and found that the more he learned, the more there was to learn, and that this was the opposite of diminishing. It was the best kind of abundance, the kind that grew instead of running out. Later, they went inside and checked on the children, Elias sleeping with his arms flung wide, Marin curled tight in a ball with one fist under her chin, and stood together for a moment in the doorway of the shared room in the quiet way that parents stand, looking at something they have made that is larger than themselves. Then they went to bed, and outside the Double S Ranch the Texas plain went on in all directions, accurately measured and carefully known and richly, fully alive, exactly as the land always is when someone takes the trouble to understand it properly. In the years that followed, Stella continued her surveying work through the expansion of the Texas Panhandle settlement, adjusting her practice as the territory changed, as railroads came and created new disputes, as homesteaders arrived in greater numbers and the need for accurate land measurement became more urgent and more contested. She trained 2 young women as her apprentices in the early 1890s, because there was no reason that what her father had given her could not be given forward, and because the more people there were who could read the land accurately, the less room there was for the kind of fraud that had nearly destroyed what she and Cecil had. Both apprentices went on to productive careers, and Stella wrote them each a letter of professional recommendation that she suspected would open more doors than anything else she had ever put her name to. Because her name, by then, meant something specific in the territory: accuracy, integrity, and the kind of stubborn thoroughness that does not let a number pass until it is right. Emmett Frazier lived a long and useful life, and eventually retired from law practice in Hartwell, and the party the community threw for him was the most well-attended gathering in Caldwell County in a decade. Cecil and Stella hosted the after-dinner portion at the Double S, and Emmett made a speech that was funny and warm, and ended with him saying that the best thing he had ever done in his professional career was send a rancher with a property dispute to see a surveyor, and everyone present who knew the history understood exactly what he meant. Elias grew into a young man with his mother's precision and his father's patience, and he came to share the management of the Double S with Cecil as he reached his 20s, with an ease and confidence that made Cecil quietly, consistently proud. He had his mother's habit of saying exactly what he meant and his father's habit of meaning everything he said. Marin grew into a young woman who climbed things with both excellent judgment and no particular concern for other people's anxiety about it, and who developed, by the time she was in her teens, a passionate interest in botany and plant science that had arrived without precedent in either parent's background, but was welcomed enthusiastically by both. Stella got her a formal botany text from a university catalog in St. Louis, which Marin read cover to cover in 2 weeks and then annotated in the margins. Cecil found her a correspondence mentor through an agricultural college in Kansas, who turned out to be delighted to have such a rigorous student regardless of her gender or age. The summers at the Double S were long and good. The evenings on the porch accumulated into a warmth that was domestic and profound at the same time, the kind of warmth that does not announce itself but simply is, year after year, present and sustaining. The ranch ran well. The land records of Caldwell County remained among the most accurately maintained in the territory. The creek ran clear in its correct channel beside the correctly surveyed boundary of the Daltrey parcel, now simply the northern section of the Double S, with water enough for the herd and the garden and the well and the future. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, In June of 1894, Cecil took Stella back to the northern fence line, to the bank of the creek where he had asked her to marry him. They walked out there in the warm evening light, the same way they had walked 10 years before, through grass that was taller now to the same water. He did not have a ring this time. He had something else. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small leather journal, worn and familiar, which she recognized immediately as one of her original field books from the Daltrey survey. The one she had been writing in the night she overheard Voss in the land office, the one she had ridden 40 miles in the rain holding against her chest under her canvas duster to keep it dry. She stared at it. "I have been keeping this safe," he said, "since you left it on the kitchen table that first morning and never asked for it back." She opened it. Her own handwriting, precise and neat, filled the pages, measurements, calculations, the careful documentation of a case being built brick by careful brick. And on the inside front cover, which she had never seen before because it had been pressed shut against the cover when she was working, she found that he had written something. Not recently. The ink was aged. He had written it 10 years ago, she understood, after she left and before she came back, or perhaps while she was still there, while they were all three at the kitchen table, and he had taken a moment she had not noticed. In his handwriting, which was nothing like hers, larger, less precise, with the careful deliberateness of a man who had not been trained in penmanship, but who formed each letter with intention, were 5 words. "She is worth 40 miles. She stood on the creek bank for a moment with the journal in her hands, and the evening light going gold around her, and those 5 words in front of her, and she felt something she could not have measured or calculated or put into a field report, something old and absolute and entirely her own. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression, the one that had started in a parlor 3 years before the wedding, and had never, in 10 years of marriage, run out of its original material. "Cecil Sheridan," she said. "Stella Ellsworth Sheridan," he said. She crossed the small distance between them and put her hands against his chest and felt his arms come around her, and she said into his collar, "I would ride it again." "I know," he said. "That is the thing about you, Stella. You always do the difficult thing and then make it look like it was never in question." "It was never in question," she said. "Not for a single mile." He held her there on the bank of the creek, on the land that was theirs, that she had measured and he had built and they had both fought for, with the water running beside them in its correct and careful channel, and the Texas sky going wide and warm and impossible above. And everything, every boundary, every measurement, every mile was exactly right. They walked back to the house in the evening's last light, their hands loosely linked, the old field journal tucked under Stella's arm. The ranch glowed ahead of them, lit from within, and through the kitchen window they could see Ruth moving, and the taller shadow that was Elia's, home for the anniversary, and the smaller, quicker figure that was Marin, who was probably doing something she ought not to be doing and doing it with complete confidence. The smell of supper reached them before the sound of the voices. Cecil held the gate for her, and she walked through it, and he followed, and they went inside together to the warmth and the noise and the life they had built, which was large and ordinary and extraordinary all at once, which is exactly what a life built correctly feels like when you have taken the trouble to survey it properly before you build. And that was the Double S Ranch, in Caldwell County, Texas, in the year 1894, a place made out of accurate measurements and stubborn love, and 40 miles ridden in the rain by a woman who knew what she was riding toward, and a man who recognized what had arrived at his door and was wise enough, finally, to refuse to let it ride away alone.